This is Yaakov Blau presenting Tehillim Perek Mem. My connection to the Nefteres, to Rabbi Drach, is that I have the privilege of teaching her niece Penina in Frisch right now, and some of her nieces have passed through Frisch in my time. I've either taught them or had a chance to interact with them in the school. Tehillim Perek Mem, as many of the Perakim Tehillim, is a multifaceted Perek with many elements that merit discussion. I want to focus on two primary issues given the allotted time. The first one is the mix of emotions that is expressed in this Perek. And the second one is a basic question throughout many of the books of Tehillim, which is the Perek dealing primarily as a metaphor for the Jewish people as a whole, or is it for individuals, either each individual for whom the emotions of the Perek resonate, or specifically about David HaMelech himself, the master author of Tehillim. In dealing with the first issue, let's quickly go through the basic structure of the Perek. The Perek basically shifts between starting off with talking about the kindness God did for the author in the past, and then moves on to a tefillah, to a prayer towards the future. If you look at the first few psukim, it says, Masech David Mizmor, Kavo kiviti Hashem v'et ilah v'shma shabati, that I, the author, had hope for God, and God listened to my prayer. Then in Pasuk Gimel, Ve'alem yibar she'on b'tit hayavan, ve'akam al sal raglai konei nashurai. God lifted me up from the pit and established me. The Perek goes on for a while. The person then turns and praises God, and is so confident about his relationship with the past. However, towards the middle of the Perek, there's a shift in tone, and it goes from the very confident talking about God in the past to asking God for help in the future. There's several psukim that do that. Among them is Pasuk Yibet, Ata Hashem l'ticha rachamech mimeni, chas v'tcha timid yitzruni. God, do not hold back your mercy from me. Your kindness and your truth sustain me. Kefafu alai ra'ot ad emispar. I'm surrounded by evils with innumerable, without end, of troubles that are surrounding me. And then finally, in the last pasuk, he says, V'ani ani ve'avyon. I am a poor person. Hashem yichashev li ezrati, malti ata. God, you are my salvation and my Savior. Elokai al ta'acher, God, do not be late in saving me. Now, in general, Tehillim is meant to represent the many varying and sometimes contradictory emotions we all feel in a relationship with God, as there are contradictory emotions in every meaningful relationship. Some of the Perakim are very hopeful, very confident that God will help us. Others more represent the troubling times where we question, we don't necessarily see God's hand 100%, and we hope for God to help us, but it's not clear that He's there. It's interesting that this Perek, I think, actually has both feelings and both emotions expressed in the Perek. The first half of the Perek is very confident, looking to the past, and talking about how God has helped out beforehand. However, as it shifts, even when we first ask God for help in the middle of the Perek, it's somewhat confident, oh, God will take care of me, He'll take care. But by the end, it seems to be a little more plaintive. I'm not really sure, is God going to do this for me or not? It's saying, God, don't be late, because I'm in a very dire situation. The thing that's fascinating about the Perek is that, yes, Tehillim is supposed to represent the contrasting emotions that we have with God, sometimes feeling very connected and very confident, and sometimes feeling very distant and calling out for His help, but not necessarily feeling the connection to Him. The thing that's fascinating about this Perek is that both of them appear in the same Perek, which I think could either represent a progression as the Perek goes on, that the person was very confident about the past, but looking toward the future, he's a bit more nervous. And it's also interesting that one could have contradictory emotions at the same time. It's not like we can only feel confident about God or feel like we need His help, feel He's a little bit far away from us. We could feel conflicting emotions at the same time. And the Perek is saying, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you have conflicting emotions. We feel several of them simultaneously. There's nothing wrong with that. That's totally fine. Both of them are expressed in the Perek, because the Perek is supposed to represent how all the contrasting emotions can be expressed to God, even if they're conflicting at the same time. Okay, that's all the first issue. The issue of the emotions that are expressed in the Perek. And as I've been saying, there's somewhat of a conflicting feeling of confidence on the one hand, and almost a lack of confidence, being unsure, and hoping for God to help out later on in the Perek. Then we move on to the second issue, which is, who is the author of this Perek? Who are we trying to describe? Now, in general, Tehillim, there's a basic issue with almost every Perek, when things are written from an individual perspective, of is individual supposed to represent all of Klal Yisrael and is spoken from each individual member's perspective? Or is it written for one particular person, sometimes David HaMelech, or sometimes whoever the situation or what's described in the Perek fits for them? This happens to be a running machloket in general in Tehillim. Particularly in our Perek, it's a machloket between Rashi on the one hand and the Radak on the other. Rashi interprets our Perek as being focused on the Jewish people as a whole. If you go back to the first pasuk, you'll see Rashi says in pasuk bet, "Kivokit Hashem b'Mitzrayim." We hope for God back in Egypt, meaning at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim from the story in Shemot. And Rashi says this mizmar, according to his reading, is also referring to the Jewish people as a whole. And you read through the whole Perek, each part of it, Rabbi's not going through all of it now because we only have 10 minutes for this year, but it's a very easy read. I would actually recommend reading through it. You can see how Rashi deals with each component of the Perek. He ties into some part of Jewish history, particularly from the time of Chumash, starting with Mitzrayim and then moving on to Matan Torah. So for example, Pasuk Gimel, when it talks about being lifted up from the pit, he said, Mibar Sha'o, he says, Masirim Shal Mitzrayim, V'Sha'an Hamayt Hayam. It's both referring to the pit as the enslavement in Egypt, using a bit metaphorically, and when it talks about also being saved from the Yam Suf, how God saved us there as well. When it talks about in Pasuk Gimel, he says, V'Tem B'Pi, there's the Pasuk now, Shir Chadash, God put a song in my mouth. That works very nicely with Rashi's interpretation, because the Shir Hayam, the song that the Jews sang after create Yam Suf. As Rashi says, Shir Chadash, Shir Hayam. Particularly fascinating, that Rashi, as I'm sure the listeners know, is very heavily influenced by Midrash, in Rashi both on Chumash and on Nevi'im and Ketuvim. All four Midrashim kind of feed on each other, where one Medrash will lead to another Medrash having a similar idea. It's fascinating that the Pasuk Hey is Ashrei Gever Asher Sam Hashem Avtacho V'Lafana Al Ravim V'Satvei Chazaf. That Pasuk is, blessed is the one who believes in God and doesn't turn his faith to false things. That pasuk is quoted by Rashi and Chumash, talking about Yosef, how Yosef had too much faith in the Sar Mashkim, and that led to being enslaved for an extra 2 years. Even though Rashi and Tehillim doesn't quote that, but it's interesting that Rashi and Tehillim interprets this parak as referring to the story of Egypt. Granted, a little bit later on, talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the story from Shemot, but it ties in nicely that the Midrash also interprets that pasuk as referring to Mitzrayim, a little bit earlier in the story of Yosef with the Sar Mashkim. He goes on to the whole parak describing that, and then the end of the parak is basically Knesset Yisrael, the Jewish people, hoping for God's help in the future because there are many troubles that have besieged the Jewish people throughout Jewish history. That's Rashi's approach. He takes the parak as referring to the Jewish people as a whole. Radak, in contrast, says it's talking about an individual. What's interesting is one could reasonably read the parak as talking about David himself. It happens to be the Radak takes it as each individual from the situation applies, these ideas apply to him. And he says it's the same idea which he uses both in the previous two parakim, Parakim Lamatet and Lamachet. If you look at Parasik Aleph in the Radak, you'll see he says, Gamzeh Mizmor, Ke'en Shem Mizmorim Shekodmelo. This Mizmor is similar to the previous two Mizmorim. Yomarato Mducha Achrei Prato, Yiten Tiat Hashem Barach. What's interesting is here he says it more specifically for someone who was sick and became better. But if you look at the previous parakim, he did it more expansively for anybody who is in a troubling situation, Mducha, somebody who's been kind of put down and trampled by life, that they say it as, we are confident for what God has done for us in the past, and we look forward to God's help in the future. So once again, you have the contrast of Rashi taking about Jewish people as a whole, and the Radak taking it more specifically as each individual. What's particularly interesting is that as the tone shifts, the author talks about being surrounded by enemies. It seems very much to be describing David's life himself. David had many stretches where things weren't going so well for him, both before he became king, when he became king, and he still civil wars, after he became king, fighting with the surrounding nations. And I think it would be very reasonable, in the Radak, it's not so specific, to apply it to David's particular situation, which often the Mefarshim do is say that the individual is David himself. I think it's a nice ending to the Perek, then describes himself as Ani Ve'avyon, I am somebody poor and destitute, and Rashi says, the Radak says, even if you're the king, it's interesting, it seems to be shifting to David himself. Even if you're the king, you in many ways are poor and destitute, and the fact that you can't do it by yourself, you need God's help. So just to sum up, this parak contains contrasting emotional states, which I think is fine, because Judaism believes that we should have varied, sometimes contradictory emotional states, but all those can be expressed in a religious way. That's what Tehillim is supposed to be, expressing our emotions in a religious manner. And as with most of Tehillim, one could argue whether it's talking about Klal Yisrael as a whole or an individual. And there's really no contradiction, it could be both. But I think the nice message at the end is to say that Afilu Melech, no matter how great we are, we understand we only need God's help. And even as much as we're confident, we understand that nothing is guaranteed, but we continue to hope that God will answer us for whatever our needs are, both nationally and individually.